I'm Frank Garza, and welcome to Here and Abroad, a podcast that follows the U.S. men's national team and their player pool across Europe, MLS, or wherever else they play their club football. On today's show, we're going to break down the USMNT's recently completed October friendlies. Last week in Mauricio Pochettino's debut as head coach, they beat Panama 2-0 in Austin, Texas. They then followed that up with a 2-0 loss to Mexico last night in Guadalajara. To help me go through these matches, I've invited Seth Vertelny to join the show. Seth is the managing editor at Pro Soccer Wire. Seth, welcome to the show.
Hey, Frank. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you back on the show as you and I were just lamenting. It's less than 24 hours from the Mexico match last night, so we still haven't fully recovered. But we'll try and keep things in perspective here and talk about the whole window. And that's kind of where I want to start. Just big picture, what were your biggest takeaways from this window?
Yeah, I think you have to start with the fact that Pochettino was operating at far less than full strength in this window. So it's kind of hard to really render too many judgments aside from the fact that, he's only had 10 days with the team. You could put together basically a first choice starting lineup with the players that were missing, especially when you throw in Pulisic and McKenzie missing the Mexico game. But I still think that you can obviously get some big picture takeaways. With those players missing, there were some opportunities for fringe players to kind of make their case. We can kind of get into which ones did and which ones didn't. I think overall, when you look at differences under Pochettino, there were some. I think the way the team played, the way they set up tactically were probably pretty similar to Greg Berhalter, which you would have to expect with such little time. He had to work with the team. There were a few personnel-based changes, but overall, the Panama game had some patchy moments, but the U.S. put together some pretty nice sequences. They deserved to win. And then the Mexico game was just a huge step back, not just in terms of how the team didn't really look ready to deal with the kind of tactical setup that Mexico had, but also just effort-wise, they just didn't put in the kind of effort that you would expect to see under a Pochettino team, and that definitely was concerning.
Yeah. I think my biggest takeaway was the kind of highs and lows of the window. I did feel positive after the Panama game. I've read a lot of people kind of wrote and talked about how it wasn't perfect, but there was progress, and I kind of agree with that. It was here in Austin. I was able to see the game live, and as I was sitting there watching the game, I thought they dominated. There was never a time where I thought they were going to lose. I know that Panama had that late chance, where they could have tied it, 1-1, and that certainly alarmed me. But for the most part, I felt pretty positive about it being Pochettino's first match, the performances I saw from a lot of the kind of these younger fringe players, and I was feeling good. But then now I'm feeling bad because that match last night, to me, that's one of the worst matches I can remember the U.S. playing in a while. It was, to me, really reminded me a lot of the Canada match in the last window, where it just looked they had no shot of scoring a goal, let alone crossing midfield. I was just so happy when they crossed midfield, and so I know I need to give it some time. I know I don't want to put too much on it, but it was just I was feeling good after the first match. Now I'm feeling terrible because I just thought the match, it's not that they lost, it was just that they played so bad. I mean, do you think, is that an overreaction at all to say that that's one of the worst matches that they've played in a while, or did you see it the same way?
No, I definitely did. I think you're right in the sense that there were times where it just felt like not only could the U.S. not generate opportunities, but they couldn't even possess the ball anywhere near Mexico's goal, especially in the period in the first half between Mexico's first goal and halftime. The U.S. just didn't really seem to have any kind of ability to just string passes together, and they were just on the back foot. And I think that was definitely concerning. You can talk about the field conditions, which weren't great, but of course both teams had to play on the same field. And I think, like I mentioned, there just were players that didn't seem up for the game, that almost seemed just overawed by the occasion, and I think that is a kind of concerning development for Pochettino, that he's going to have to evaluate over the next month. Like, which players can he really count on in a big spot? And I think the team looked a little bit better in the second half. I think some of the subs that he brought on helped. Thinking about guys like Alejandro Zandejas and Brandon Vasquez and Tanner Tessman, certainly were better than the players that they replaced. But yeah, overall, it's a really concerning performance against a team that, as we know, the U.S. is had a lot of success against lately. This was the first time they lost to Mexico since 2019, and it snapped a 7-game unbeaten run against Mexico.
Yeah. I enjoyed being able to say that Mexico hadn't beaten us in 5 years, 5+ years. I enjoyed that, and it makes me a little sad for that streak to end. But yeah, I want to talk about some of those players that you mentioned, but let's first talk about the coach. Pochettino's first window. This is the first time we got kind of a look at how he wants to play, what he was going to do different. What did look different to you in terms of tactics, strategy, or just overall how he managed the game versus what we've seen for so long with, Greg Berhalter and the interims that kind of took his place for sometimes.
Yeah, I think the tactical setup looked pretty similar. A 4-2-3-1 for the most part. They used three defenders in the build, with Robinson going up high on the left side, and Scally tucking in and staying back on the right. Those are things that we saw under Berhalter. I was interested in a few of the personnel decisions that Pochettino made, that were a little different. Against Panama, you saw Brendan Aronson play as a 10, which you just haven't really seen very much at the national team level, especially when guys like Gio Reyna are healthy. That's kind of his spot. And I thought he did okay against Panama. Against Mexico, he played out wide again, and that was honestly one of the worst individual performances I've seen from the U.S. in a long time. It was a pretty terrible game for him. Every time he got it, he seemed to give it away.
Yeah,
Another,
he seemed to get bullied a little bit. It
yeah,
almost looked like a boy playing against men at times, where it was like he'd get the ball and he'd just kind of get pushed off and they'd take it and he'd just be kind of frustrated thinking he got fouled. I mean, I just saw that over and over again last night.
yeah, that's a theme that we've seen from him, and one of the reasons he struggled in the Premier League with Leeds the first time that he was with that club, and this time around he's actually had a pretty good start to the season playing as a 10. So it was nice to see him get a chance there. But yeah, last night was not great. Yunus Musa played wide right in both matches, although he kind of moved inside against Mexico at times. That's something that, again, kind of like Erickson, we see him play that role a little bit at the club level and not so much at the national team level. And against Panama, it worked out great. He scored his first national team goal. He arrived in the box at the right time to get on the end of that cross from Christian Pulisic. And also, Josh Sargent got the chance to start at forward in both games. Balogun wasn't there, so that took away an option from Pochettino, but he also had the option to start Pepe, at least in the first game, and he had the option to start Brandon Vasquez. He didn't do that, so he clearly wanted to give Sargent a run out. As far as his performance, it's kind of hard to evaluate, honestly, because he just was a little star for service. He didn't really impose himself too much on either game, but especially last night against Mexico, he just barely saw the ball. And then, I was interested to see Aiden Morris and Gianluca Busio start together in that double pivot role in both matches. Obviously, the team's preferred options like Johnny Cardozo, Tyler Adams, Weston McKennie weren't there. But Pochettino could have started Musa inside. He could have started Tanner Tessman, and he didn't. And so clearly he saw something that he liked in that pairing. And I think they did pretty well against Panama. We'll continue the theme. Pretty well against Panama, not so great against Mexico.
Yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of just kind of subtle change. Nothing looked drastically different, in terms, tactically. I don't think anybody was blown away as like, wow, Pochettino did this or that, and it was so different. It was these subtle things, kind of like you talked about, which I thought was cool. Moving Musa to the right, and he talked about he did that to kind of give him some more confidence, and so he didn't feel the pressure of having to, really participate in the build up. That playing on the right wing could like maybe allow him to play more freely, and it resulted in a goal. And I was like, well, that's cool. That's a subtle change that Pochettino did, that made a difference. So again, yeah, the theme we're going to keep going over and over again is feeling positive after the Panama game. I didn't see a whole lot last night, but I will say one difference that I did see in terms of the game last night was I don't think Pochettino took this game against Mexico as seriously as like maybe a Berhalter or an American coach would. It seemed like just another friendly to him. I don't know if I don't think it like Berhalter or another American coach would have brought anything less than their best team down there, even if it meant saving some players, in the Panama match. And I just didn't think Pochettino really valued the rivalry as much, or the unbeaten streak as much as maybe some of the other coaches would have. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think in the press conference before the game, he was asked about the rivalry and the unbeaten streak, and I think he did kind of try to downplay that a little bit and suggested that the U.S. wanted to win, but they want to win every game, and the opponent wasn't as important, especially in the context of a game where it was just his second match in charge, and he had been with the team for a little over a week. I don't know what sort of options he would have had if he wanted to really go for the win, aside from maybe pushing to keep Pulisic around. But clearly, he was a little concerned about his workload. He said it before the Panama game, so probably overall for Pulisic, it was better for him to leave. And as we've talked about, there were just so many players that were missing. I was interested to see that there wasn't any rotation really. 10 of the same 11 players started between the Panama game and the Mexico game, with Pulisic the only exception, and Malik Tillman going on in his spot. But yeah, I think that for Pochettino, last night was basically another game, and the U.S. maybe didn't play like it was a rivalry game. Like I mentioned, I think where they really fell short was it just seemed like they were kind of overawed by the moment, and they just were losing 50-50 balls, and they kind of shrunk as the game went on, except for maybe the last 15-20 minutes where they started to find themselves a little bit.
Yeah. Let's talk about some more of these player performances. When you look at the overall window, who's a player that you thought had a really good window, or just a positive window, or helped their case a little bit?
Yeah, I think Matt Turner. I think first of all, just the fact that he started both games was a positive for him. That wasn't necessarily a given. Patrick Schulte started the first game of the last window, and so it seemed like maybe this was more of an open competition. But Turner, he made some great saves, especially that double save against Panama. Mexico, can't really fault him for either of the goals. I think the distribution is still an issue and probably always will be with him, but He looks like the starter under Pochettino. So that also, as we mentioned, Yunus Musa against Panama, scoring your first goal, showing the kind of versatility that he has, I thought was positive. A couple guys that I mentioned that came on as subs against Mexico, Alex Zendejas and Brandon Vasquez, two guys that play in Mexico. I thought showed that they probably deserve a little bit more of a look. I thought Gianluca Busio had a pretty good game against Panama, less so against Mexico, but he's playing weekly in Italy, and I think that he's somebody that showed that he can definitely be part of the picture in central midfield, especially when some of the guys ahead of him are injured. Yeah, I think obviously Christian Pulisic, but we already knew that. Yeah, those are guys that kind of stand out to me as having good windows.
As I thought about this, it was really hard for me to pick anybody that played last night because it's
Yeah,
just, even though I felt good about some of those guys after Panama, I just left with such a sour taste after that match last night. And so I thought about like a Mark McKenzie, who I thought had an excellent game, against Panama. That's really the best game I've seen him have in a, playing for the US, MNT. I think he's taken a step up, this season, at his club, and it showed in that performance against Panama. Now he was supposed to start last night against Mexico, and then he was a late scratch, due to injury, and maybe I would have felt differently if he, would have played that match. But I think he put in a pretty positive performance, and I think really put himself right in the middle of that competition for the center back position on this team, which I think is one of the more wide open positions there are. I thought Ricardo Pepi, because again he did something with his opportunity. Josh Sargent had that basically a sitter in front of goal in the Panama match that he missed. Pepe came in for, I don't know, what was it, 20 minutes or so, got one chance and, put it away, and I thought, even though he didn't get a lot of minutes, he went out there and put away his chance. And so I thought he continues to, stick around the conversation, even though he's not getting a lot of minutes yet, at PSV. And then I agree with you with some of these late additions last night. I thought Brandon Vasquez looked good, coming off the bench. I thought he was really our one hope to kind of get a goal, that if somebody could get like a good cross into him, he could do something with it. But he looked lively. What about the opposite? Who's a player that you think had a poor window, or maybe just didn't take advantage of the opportunity that they got?
yeah. I think like you said, most of the guys that played last night took a step back in terms of where they might stand in the eyes of Mauricio Pochettino. I think a guy that I mentioned, Brendan Aronson. He's started 4 games in a row now for the U.S., but it's just not really happening for him in terms of end product with the national team. Even though, like I mentioned, he's doing better at the club level. Um, Malik Tillman, similar story, doing great at the club level. Continues to impress week in, week out with PSV. With the U.S., it just hasn't happened. I mean, a lot of his appearances have come off the bench, but even in the starts, he just hasn't really imposed himself, and it was disappointing because he's got all the talent in the world. He's somebody that could and maybe should be challenging Gio Reyna for that 10 role, even when Reyna's healthy. It hasn't happened. Um, you mentioned Mark McKenzie being out last night. Miles Robinson got another chance at center back, didn't take it. Had a giveaway that led to the free kick that ended up being Mexico's first goal. Yeah, that center back position is not looking great right now for the U.S. Tim Ream, not a great performance last night. You got to give Raul Jimenez lots of credit for that tackle on Ream that led directly to the second goal. But, you know, Ream should probably be getting rid of the ball quicker there. And, the end obviously is coming for Ream, and it's no shade on him. He's just kind of reaching the point in his career where his national team run is going to be ending soon. But, he continues to play for the U.S. in part because there just hasn't really been a clear option to replace him. And so, yeah, Josh Sargent, like you mentioned too, even though he didn't get a ton of service, you were right to point out the one chance that he did get against Panama, and he just blasted it way over when he could have done a lot better.
Yeah. I think Josh Sargent, Miles Robinson, Malik Tillman were the three that I had written down. Josh Sargent, not because he played so poorly, but he just 2 starts, really no productivity whatsoever, there. And I know there's only so much you can do, but still, no assists, no goals, not a lot of, real clear chances for him. Miles Robinson, I agree. I know it's tough when you're like warming up and you think you're going to be on the bench, and then all of a sudden you're starting. But that giveaway, his giveaway last night changed the game. He had that terrible giveaway where he could have just laid it off to Turner. Instead, he just kind of launches this crazy pass to midfield, turns the ball over. Soon after that, there's the penalty called, and then we get the first goal, and Mexico gets the first goal, and the game was different after that. It actually looked fine up until that, but that turnover just really changed the game there. And then Malik Tillman, I feel like every single time he plays, I had the same conversation with people where you're like, okay, is this the time? He's finally going to have a good game, in a U.S. jersey. We're still waiting for that performance, to match what he does at PSV. And again, didn't really stand out, at all last night again. And he keeps getting these opportunities and does fine, more or less, doesn't do terrible, but you're just waiting for kind of that breakout performance. And, he didn't take it. Yeah. So I guess that leads to what's next for the U.S. Next time they get together will be in November for the Nations League quarterfinals. They'll be playing Jamaica. The first match, it's a home and away series. The first match will be away at Jamaica on November 14th. Then they'll play at home in St. Louis on November 18th. What's your thoughts on that matchup, and what are you looking forward to seeing in that window?
Well, hopefully we'll see some of the U.S.'s better players get back to full health between now and then. When you look at some of the guys that missed this camp that could be back, Tyler Adams, Weston McKennie, Chris Richards, Tim Weah, Johnny Cardozo. Obviously, those guys are difference makers for this team. But at the same time, there still will be some big names that are not healthy. I'm thinking of Balogun, Gio Reyna, obviously Serginho Dest, and who knows what players could go out between now and then. And so I think you're already looking at a window where the U.S. is going to be shorthanded to some extent. But Pochettino will hopefully have a few more of those bigger names back in the fold. And as far as Jamaica goes, it was only a few months ago that the U.S. almost got bounced from the Nations League in the semifinals, only to have a kind of miraculous last-second own goal send the game into extra time, where the U.S. scored a couple goals from Haji Wright. So obviously, this is going to be a tough matchup, and I think for Pochettino's purposes, it's good that Jamaica is going to challenge his team. He needs some of these games, especially in competitions that actually count as opposed to friendlies. But yeah, like the U.S. isn't going to get a lot of chances to play high level opponents, and so they do need to kind of take advantage of these opportunities to play up and coming CONCACAF teams like Jamaica. But this is still a series where the U.S. should be favored, where they should expect to win, and I think for Pochettino, the changes might need to be made on the margins between now and November. Maybe one or two guys that made this roster and didn't really impress won't be back, and maybe he'll give a couple guys chances that weren't there this month. But really, if the U.S. can get back to some semblance of health, they should be pretty clearly favored to go through.
Yeah. I think that's what I'm most looking forward to, is seeing what the roster looks like. I don't feel like I learned a lot with this last roster, in terms of the selection, in terms of who Pochettino values. But now, after spending all this time with the players, seeing these individual performances, it'll be interesting to see who from this roster maybe gets left off, and which new guys, are brought in. I think that's going to be, really interesting. And then this is going to be challenging, like you said. It's not just Jamaica's a good team, but then when you think the next game this U.S. team plays is going to be at Jamaica, which is a hard place to play. And I tried to get some stats on this. The last time they played in Jamaica was World Cup qualifying in 2021. They drew 1-1, tough game, and then I was able to find some stats on all of the World Cup qualifying matches that the U.S. and Jamaica have played in Jamaica, and the U.S. has only won once. 1 win, 1 loss, and 5 draws. So it's tough. The U.S. doesn't have a good history of going into Jamaica and getting a W. They don't necessarily have to get a win. You think if they go in and get a draw, then they play Jamaica at home, that they're going to be in pretty good shape. But it's going to be another tough atmosphere. Not as tough as the one probably they just experienced in Mexico, but it's going to be tough. It's going to be a challenge, and it's going to be interesting to see, how they play there. Well, thank you so much, Seth, for being on the show. I'll make sure and put links in the show notes to your X account, which is at @sfertelny, and also to your work at Pro Soccer Wire. Thanks again for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to everyone for listening to Here and Abroad. If you enjoyed the episode, please do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or that follow button if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or somewhere else. Thank you so much. I'm Frank Garza. You can follow me on X at FrankGarza007, and I'll be back next week with a new episode.